Our wise forefathers established union and amity between the 5 and later 6 nations, which has given us great weight and authority with our neighbors. We are a powerful confederacy, and by observing the same methods our forefathers have taken, you will acquire fresh strength and power. Therefore, whatever befalls you, never fall out with one another. An eagle soaring overhead watched that none of the 6 nations broke the peace. According to one legend, the earliest formation of the Confederacy is linked to a total eclipse of the sun on August 12, 1142 AD. While much of Europe and the Middle East were engaged in holy wars that would last centuries, Iroquois peacemakers were seeking harmony with their neighbors in the form of a League of Nations, or Confederacy. The highly egalitarian alliance south of the Great Lakes rivals the governments of Iceland and Switzerland as the oldest continuously functioning democracy on Earth. Many centuries later, their ways would be challenged when the Europeans began to arrive on the shores of the New World. Thayendanegea, also known as Joseph Brant, would fight for his people as he stood at the crossroads of worlds in collision. Thayendanegea was born near what is now the Muskingum River of Ohio during a hunting expedition in the spring of 1742. Without formal records, details of his beginnings remain murky. What is clear is that Brant's father died shortly after he was born. His mother remarried a Mohawk man and raised her family in the scenic Mohawk Valley. Thayendanegea is a Mohawk name meaning one who binds two together for strength. The family or clan is the basic unit of the Iroquois society. Each person has an orenda or soul. A single orenda is weak, but unified at fireside can become strong and capable of virtue. The Mohawks form part of the Confederacy, along with the Onondaga, Oneida, Cayuga, and Seneca, the original 5 nations. The Tuscarora joined in 1722 to become the 6 nations, or Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse. As one of the world's oldest democracies, the Confederacy has endured for nearly 1,000 years into the 21st century. The family or clan live under one roof, known as the Longhouse. Women were responsible for raising the children, farming, gathering, cleaning, and tanning the skins brought back from the hunt. Men did the hunting, defended their families from outside dangers, and constructed the longhouses in the village. All were fed and treated fairly as part of the clan, no matter their contribution. A longhouse structure could be up to 90 meters in length, housing hundreds of people. The Iroquois society is matrilineal, descending from the female line. Women held sway in council, and clan mothers had the power to appoint chiefs and veto wars. Family members lived together with their family in a single longhouse. A village could contain anywhere from a few small structures to dozens. Once the British arrived on the shores of North America, they soon took advantage of earlier bad blood between the French and the Iroquois, forming alliances with at least 4 of the 6 nations. The Duke of York's Charter, the original treaty between the British and Iroquois, was signed in Albany, New York in 1664. With loyalties divided among the Iroquois and a fragile accord with the British Crown, the turbulent struggle for the North American interior was underway. An important influence in Brant's young life was a prominent British naval officer named Sir William Johnson. Johnson developed strong bonds with the Mohawk people and became a trusted companion to Molly Brant, Joseph's half-sister. They would eventually marry and raise 8 children together. Molly was the matron of Johnson Hall, where young Joseph would become a natural part of the household. The family held large peace gatherings at the Grand Home until Johnson's death in 1774. Johnson saw potential in the young Mohawk boy and soon took him under his wing. At only 13 years of age, Brant accompanied Johnson into battle when the 7 Years' War broke out with the French at Lake George in 1755. Brant would later tell his sister Molly about the terrors of battle. To steady my nerves, I had to cling onto a sapling to summon courage. However, Brant learned quickly. He soon developed skills and strategies that made him a warrior to be feared by his enemy. He once confessed, although he enjoyed the music of the harpsichord, the sound of the drums and trumpet made his heart quicken. Over the years, Brant and Johnson would fight together in numerous campaigns, including Fort Oswego, Miami, Pitt, and Detroit. Finally, a turning point came when Brant hit his stride during an intense battle at Fort Niagara in 1759. The British prevailed, and the fort was secured with all provisions and military supplies intact. The loss to the French meant their lifeline to Louisiana was severed. When an opportunity came Johnson's way to send a few promising Indian youths to receive a proper education, he knew it was a chance not to be missed. Dr. Eleazar Wheelock was a nobleman and founder of the future Dartmouth College in Connecticut. An above-average teacher, Wheelock took notice of the young Mohawk boy. He remarked that Brant was of a sprightly genius, of manly and genteel deportment, and of a modest and benevolent temper. Brant's studies included English, mathematics, Latin, and Greek, with a little practical instruction in agriculture. Each school day began and ended with prayers. Of Brant's tenure at school, Wheelock told others, "Joseph is indeed an excellent student. He has much endeared himself to me, as well as to his master, and everybody by his good behavior." He became a competent instructor and was baptized as a Christian. Brant would later assist Reverend John Ogilvie in revising, extending, and reprinting the Mohawk Prayer Book. Having just completed school, Brant was soon called into action quelling unrest led by the Chief Pontiac of the Ottawas over British policies in the region. After some bloodshed, hostilities came to an end when the pen replaced the sword in solving the conflict. A treaty signed at Fort Stanwix in 1768 established the peace and Iroquois territory for the time being. Brant returned to his Mohawk Valley home. Joseph Brant would marry 3 times. His first wife, Owaissa, was an ill-tempered Onega girl that would bear him 2 children, Isaac and Christine. They raised horses and cattle on 100 acres of land. After 7 years of marriage, Owaissa died of tuberculosis. A second marriage to her half-sister Onagala also ended with her demise to TB a year later. Brant would remain single until 1775, when he married Catherine, a Mohawk woman that would bear him 8 children. Although more ill-tempered than Owaissa, Catherine and Joseph could not resist one another. Though he fought for peace on the battlefield, Brant would rarely find it at home. Peace in the valley would be short-lived. Tension was mounting between the British and American settlers. No taxation without representation. The now famous rallying cry rang out across the land when the British tried to collect taxes from the colonies. At this crucial time, Sir William Johnson, who had been instrumental in keeping the Iroquois loyal to the crown, died of a stroke. With his passing, Colonel Guy Johnson, a nephew, took over. With Brant's help, they used all their powers to retain the loyalty of the Iroquois for the battle ahead. The American colonists blundered when they sent minor officials of the Continental Congress to convince the Iroquois to change sides. Brant did not trust the situation and was soon called upon to consult with Sir Guy Carleton in Montreal. It was arranged that Brant would travel with Colonel Guy Johnson to London, England, to secure loyalty with the British Crown. It was 1775, and Brant, already a captain with the British military, was now traveling to London as an ambassador for his people. The British rolled out the royal red carpet for Brant and his entourage in a scene that echoed an earlier time. In 1710, the 4 Indian kings from the New World had come to London seeking Queen Anne's support in their conflict with the French. A descendant from one of the 4 kings, Brant now traveled in the footsteps of his ancestors as they moved through the crowded streets of London. For the new arrivals, Montreal would have seemed a mere hamlet by comparison. They were driven to St. James Palace by state coach, where a formal audience with King George III and his wife, Queen Charlotte, had been arranged. Brant was escorted into a luxuriant throne room, where the king and his family were attired in rich robes of silk and velvet. Brant saw Guy Johnson kneel to kiss the hand of the king. When his turn came, Brant pushed the king's hand aside, declaring that he kissed the hand of no man. After a hush came over the assembled, he wisely added that he would gladly kiss the hand of the queen. He returned home from the royal visit reassured that the crown would honor the Iroquois losses, while confirming to the king their continued support. Brant became disappointed when he learned that his teacher, Dr. Wheelock, had joined the rebel cause. Wheelock tried to persuade Brant to shift loyalties. Brant reminded him that 'twas thee who taught me to fear God and honor the king, and added, "This I propose to do." The Mohawk Valley erupted into war. Casualties were heavy on both sides as they set out to capture Fort Stanwix in 1777. Brant led the Iroquois forces accompanied by Loyalist and British regiments, including Colonel Johnson's Royal Greens and Colonel Butler and his famous Rangers. The tenacity of the American forces meant that the war was going to be long and bloody. Neighbors found themselves pitted one against the other. Raids took place on the German flats in the Mohawk Valley and in the Susquehanna region of Pennsylvania. Settlers were killed, cattle driven away, and crops burned. Brant knew that war meant extreme violence, but was against needless bloodshed and cruelty. "I do not make war on women and children," Joseph Brant. The Confederation was divided as to where their loyalties lay, and fought on both sides of the conflict. The Mohawks, Senecas, and Cayugas supported the British, while the Oneidas, some Onondagas, and Tuscaroras sided with the Americans. General James Clinton and Commander John Sullivan led their colonist troops against Newtown, it was apparent to Brant that the tide of the war was turning in favor of the Americans. Brant was everywhere, urging his men on and contesting every position, but when he saw they were in danger of being surrounded, crossed the river and fled. At General Washington's command, Sullivan swept his troops through 41 Iroquois towns, destroying all within his path. The devastation forced thousands of homeless Iroquois to seek refuge at Fort Niagara. To add to their misery, the winter of 1779-80 was one of the worst on record. Starvation and sickness meant more loss of life for the Indians and their allies. Brant could now see the futility of the battles they fought and that the king's men were no longer invincible. He witnessed the destruction of his own home and knew the writing was on the wall. The surrender of Lord Cornwallis, the British commander at Yorktown, on October 19, 1781, brought the Revolutionary War to an end. American independence was now assured and made official with the Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783. The outcome of the war saddened Brant, who remarked, "The Mohawks have on all occasions shown their zeal and loyalty to their great king, yet they have been very badly treated by his people." The Treaty of Fort Stanwix of 1768 had long established Indian territory in the Mohawk Valley. In the treaty, no provision had been made for the return of the Iroquois lands to their rightful owners. Brant believed the king had no right to cede the Indian lands to the American colonists, nor they to accept them. It was clear that the Iroquois way of life was threatened by the steady flow of Europeans arriving along the shores of North America. Brant's days as a warrior were over, and his work as a statesman for his people now began in earnest. When he arrived at Governor Haldimand's Quebec headquarters to address these issues, the officer on duty at first declined his request. Resplendent in his silver epaulettes and eagle-feathered headdress, he stood up to his full 6-foot height and announced that he was Iroquois Chief Joseph Brant. He was ushered in immediately. After hearing him out fully on these matters, Haldimand asked Brant to consider settling his people in Upper Canada by the Bay of Quinte near Belleville. Unable to return to their lands south of the Great Lakes, Brant took this offer back to his people. A group of Mohawks, led by Brant's cousin John Deseronto, selected the Bay of Quinte. While Deseronto and others opted for the site, most followed Brant to the Grand River Valley. It was strategic as a barrier against an American invasion should hostilities resume, and aided the fur trade to the southwest. On October 25, 1784, Haldimand, with the king's blessing, signed a formal deal ceding land on both sides of the Grand River, 6 miles wide from Rome as the source to the mouth of Lake Erie, which they and their posterity are to enjoy forever. The newly appointed governor, John Graves Simcoe, and Lady Simcoe paid a visit to Brant on the Grand River. While Simcoe was friendly, he was also suspicious that Brant was trying to create an independent Iroquois nation. By 1784-85, more than 1,500 Six Nations people had moved into the new settlement at Brant's Ford. However, as his land policies came under increasing attack from both sides, Brant attempted further negotiations in both Britain and the U.S. to improve conditions for his people. Among the Indians, there are but 2 roads to greatness. One is the warpath, and the other, the council. The council road is the most famous because fewest are able to travel on it. Once again, Thayendanegea sought to forge the Six Nations and the Western Indians into a great pan-tribal confederacy. This he felt was needed to help protect native interests on the rapidly changing Anglo-American frontier. An Indian Council circle at Fort Sandusky in 1783 sought to repair the rift among the Indian nations brought about by the Revolutionary War. Thayendanegea held a special place of honor among the chiefs of the Wyandot, Delaware, Shawnee, Cherokee, Ojibwa, Ottawa, Miami, and Mingo nations. Here, Brant presented his grand vision to the council. We, the chief warriors of the 6 nations, with this belt bind your hearts and minds with ours. Let there be peace or war, it shall never disunite us, for our interests are alike. Conservation of the land and nature was a common belief and practice among the Iroquois. Every 10 to 30 years, the entire village would pick up stakes and set down roots in a new location. This periodic migration allowed the soil to recover, as well as the fish and wildlife to replenish their numbers. By 1784, it was clear that neither the Americans nor the British were going to allow the Indian nations to occupy their traditional lands south of Lake Ontario. Governor Clinton of New York even tried to prevent Brant's meeting with commissioners sent by General Washington. Furious at these dealings, and unhappy with his inability to sell off Indian lands in the Grand Valley when necessary for provisions, Brant returned to London to negotiate directly with the king for a second time. Once again, Brant had the king's ear and was given a royal reception by the leading figures of London's inner circle. At a fancy costume ball in Brant's honor, a Turkish diplomat, intrigued by Brant's costume and believing he wore a mask, came forward and tweaked his nose. Seeing the humor in the situation, Brant suddenly let loose with a blood-curdling war cry, drew his tomahawk, and swung it over the diplomat's head. The women shrieked while the diplomat stood frozen. Soon, all was explained, and gaiety and laughter resumed. With the king's promise of compensation, Brant returned to the Grand Valley in 1786, only to find that unity among members of the Indian Confederacy had failed. To avoid another Indian uprising like Pontiac's Revenge, Brant received a special invitation to meet with President George Washington in Philadelphia on June 20th, 1792. I was offered 1,000 guineas, and to have the pension I received from Great Britain doubled merely on condition that I would use my endeavors to bring about a peace. But this I rejected. The Americans increased their bribe, but all they got from Brant was a promise to do what he could. Brant and the other peacemakers, however, could not get the embattled members of the Confederacy to agree on terms. The European conquest of the Americas was an event unparalleled in human history. Spain came for the silver and gold. The French sought the fur trade, while Great Britain was expanding her empire. The sad irony, long after the dust had settled, is that the U.S. Congress in 1988 passed a bill stating, "The union of the original 13 U.S. colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy." In his speech of 1744, Canazatego used a metaphor that many arrows cannot be broken as easily as one, which inspired the bundle of 13 arrows held by the eagle in the Great Seal of the United States. Joseph Brant returned to the Grand Valley in Upper Canada, demoralized as his dream of an all-Indian Confederacy was dashed. He now sought comfort in his faith, and the completion of the Mohawk Chapel, which he felt would afford his people similar consolation. Constructed of square logs and boarded on the outside, the church tower became a landmark, while the huge bell cast in England resounded warmly throughout the community. On a brilliant Sunday in June 1788, Indians from the area came by canoe, on horseback, and by foot to fill the church to overflowing. 65 people were baptized that day, while the congregation sang hymns with great joy and enthusiasm. By 1782, King George III had awarded a Loyalist land grant to Brant for his support of the British during the American Revolutionary War and more. The 3,450-acre parcel of land at the head of the lake, known as Captain Brant's Tract, was the amount he was able to pace around from sunrise to sunset. It later became known as Wellington Square, and today is the city of Burlington, Ontario. Joseph Brant was known for his generous spirit of hospitality when visitors came calling at his home on the head of the lake. At a joyous gathering of Six Nations people in 1795, the mood was dampened when Isaac, his eldest son from his first marriage, began drinking and cursing his father. When Joseph tried to quell his son's rage, Isaac lunged at him with a knife. In self-defense, Joseph struck back and cut Isaac's scalp. After being treated for his wounds, Isaac defiantly tore off the bandages to expose the wound and would eventually die of his injuries. The incident left Brant shattered and heartbroken at the death of his firstborn and favorite son by his own hand. Brant withdrew and began to spend more time at the head of the lake and less with his people on the Grand River. In a kind of self-imposed exile, Brant took solace during his remaining days, translating the Book of Common Prayer and the Gospel of St. Mark into the Mohawk language. Joseph Brant passed away at his Wellington Square home in November of 1807. His third wife, Catherine, chose their fourth and youngest son, John, to take the place of their great father. John Brant carried on his father's legacy of loyalty to the British. He fought in all the major battles during the War of 1812, and when the war ended, lived in his father's home at the head of the lake. In 1827, John Brant was appointed superintendent of the Six Nations, and years later would return as a member of the provincial parliament. A Mohawk legend tells the story of a young boy who dreamt that one day he would wear the magic moccasins and lead his people. Joseph Brant was that young boy. While his place in history as warrior chief is well documented, it will be his efforts as a statesman that will endure. After all my experience, and after every exertion to divest myself of prejudice, I am obliged to give my opinion in favor of my own people. Joseph Brant. The spirit of hospitality established by Joseph Brant carried on long after he was gone, with the Brant House, the elegant Brant Hotel, and later the renowned Brant Inn. The poorest to the most distinguished were welcomed guests at Brant's home. At a time when the simple log cabin was the most common form of abode, a visitor would have been impressed. The spacious entranceway and parlor were carpeted throughout, and furnished with mahogany tables and fashionable chairs acquired on trips to Europe. For overnight guests, breakfast was served by an Indian woman wearing a man's hat. The morning feast consisted of smoked beef, ham, eggs, broiled chickens, hot rolls with butter in ice coolers, tea and coffee, all served in style.